essentially every 8 years. It's every city in California, right? Every city in California has to update their housing element of their general plan. So our general plan is basically our document for planning the long-term growth of the city. It has lots of elements. There's circulation, there's housing, there's recreation, but it's only housing is the one that gets updated every 8 years. Coincidentally, that coincides with the arena numbers that Nicole will talk about. Typically, general plans overall get updated for every 20 years or so, but the city can do it more often. So that's really what this is about. We're working on a draft which is due to the state here before too long. They'll make comments, and in fact, we'll have another one of these workshops to discuss the draft and what's in it before we start taking it to planning commission and council. And see, we had at least one planning commission. So I'm going to turn it over to Nicole. She's going to give a presentation. I'd like to give a little bit of my observations now that I've been in 29 columns, kind of what are our headwinds and tailwinds that I've seen. I've been in this job for about 4 years now. I was actually thinking about it last night over at Jason's, and I thought, very productive thought process. So Nicole, I'll hand it over to you.
Hello everybody, my name's, I think, if it's all right with you, while I talk, I'll take this off. Sorry. My name is Nicole Christ. I'm with Terra Nova Planning, and we're a consulting firm that does urban and environmental planning, and we're working on 7 housing elements. Right now, as Travis indicated, this is an element that is required to be updated on a regular basis. We've done the data collection in terms of statistics, and I'm going to start with just a short presentation on the statistics that pertain to the city. I really would like this to be more of a conversation though, so I don't want to talk too long so that we can get all of your input on what is of concern to you all and what we should be focusing on. So, as Travis said, that the housing element is part of the general plan. It is the only element in the general plan that requires a regular update. That update is set by state law and is based on our region. So the SCAG region is the one that is, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk in acronyms. You have to stop me and make me explain. Southern California Association of Governments is our regional council of governments, and they're responsible for all of Southern California except San Diego County. And they set the regional housing needs assessment, which is our allocation for the next 8 years. The planning period that we're working towards, I put down as 2022 to 2029. It's 8 years from October of 2021 to October of 2029. But for all practical purposes, it's 2022 to 2029. We are responsible for facilitating housing. The city is not responsible for building the housing. And it's housing for all economic levels and all social segments of the community. The state focuses on what is sometimes called affordable housing or lower income housing, and they assign us the number of units by income level that we're required to facilitate. So some basic facts, and I know this one is going to be harder to read, the type is small. Our 2019 population is just over 26,000 people. We have a relatively young community. our median age is just over 24 years. And 72% of the city's population is under 35. We have 8,279 households. That can be families, that can be unrelated people living together, but that is occupied housing units that have multiple people in them. Our median housing income is relatively low, especially compared to the county median. We're at just over 44,000, and the county median is just over 60,000. We have 26% of our population that works. That's 6,700 residents. The primary sectors that they're employed in are education, healthcare, and social assistance, public administration, and arts, recreation, accommodation, and food service.
Nicole,
Yes.
you want to ask questions now or later?
You can, I am glad to answer questions.
Is that normal to have 1/4 of your population working? Is that a typical thing that you'd see in a community in the United States?
That is lower than the communities we work in,
Okay.
generally.
What's the source of the statistics?
American Community Survey, which is the census, the census predictions that come out between census years. Okay, we're gonna do this one at a time. 1, 2, 3. Yes, ma'am.
You gather your statistics for percentage of people that are working. Do you include in that independent contractors, people that work for themselves, or are you getting those statistics from the job market?
We're getting the statistics from the census, which gathers from in between census years, gathers from different sources. Those are people who are reporting that they are employed, whether it is in traditional employment or as an independent contractor.
So what year was
This is 2019 data.
2019.
Yes, sir.
How much of this information is for households that are incorporated in the Marine Corps base?
That's what, how much of it is the base?
This is city limits.
Isn't the Marine Corps base part of city limits?
The main side part of the base is, yes.
So how much of that percentage is from the main side?
The working, or the
The
total?
households, working, the information.
Yeah, all of it is, includes the main
Yeah,
side.
what percentage? I mean, when we're talking about town, we're talking about base.
We
We're talking
don't-
about two different things. I can't go up there.
And we can't differentiate the information.
I think you do it, why not?
I think, Frank, what's the latest base? Was it 10,000 on the base or 12,000?
Yeah, there's 11,000 active duty Marines, but not all of them live on base. That's a good point, Jamie. And we can get that data, I think, from the base as far as units, units out. So if the households, we can get all that unit information out there. I don't know how we would parse out, I guess, the income and household information.
Well, I think when you're coming up with the median age, that's probably all part of it too, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is more germane because that's just the reality of our residents, because we are a very community. So I think that's pretty valid, but I think, having that parsed out is probably a good piece of it. And we can work with the base to try to get that household data.
And the employment is civilian employment, so that does not include military employment.
It's not.
I mean, it's a follow-up on this military question. I don't see any military employment in here. And my assumption is that the majority of our employers or employees are military related. So I don't think this is a good data, if that is the case.
You mean that most people work at the base?
Correct.
If they are civilians working at the base, that's reflected in this number.
Correct.
In this number.
Right, but a lot of our Marines that are active military personnel are not living in the base, live in 29 farms. And you're saying that those who are excluded from this data?
Their employment is excluded, yes.
Maybe it's a way to deal with this is to footnote this with some
Understood. Ma'am?
Do active duty military personnel report on the census based on their home of record or where they're currently stationed?
It's their residence, so it is not necessarily the base, or not necessarily 29 homes. Yes, ma'am.
So if this is 2019, then this report is really outdated already. Because what has happened in the last year in this community, the whole Morongo Basin, and in this community, has changed all your dynamics.
Good point.
We are anxiously awaiting the 2020 census numbers, and hopefully when those come out, we'll be able to update all of this.
I think the whole thing should be based on assumptions of what's current.
Making it, or assuming anything in from 2020 is not, it was not a normal year under any circumstances. And so with the possible exception of population, total population, I would not use employment numbers, for example, for the
Absolutely, no
2020.
employment numbers, but population numbers and the amount of houses that have sold, it's been just incredible.
Understood. We unfortunately don't have 2020 census data
So it all started
yet.
maybe mid-2020 and it's going into 21, so everything that we're talking about is not possible.
Well, I mean, things all, you know, part of this is always going to be fluid, right? I mean, you know, this is a point in time that we're looking at this, to be able to update our housing element. We understand that 2020, you know, may have dramatic value changes, maybe even out of town relocation changes. But this is a point in time, so this is good data at this point in time. I think September 30th is when the census is supposed to be released. And Nicole, will you be updating that based on, you know, as far as our time frame, September 30th when it gets released, updating things?
We will be through HCB's first review by September 30th. If they come out on time and if it's thorough enough, we can update the data based on the census numbers at that time. Yes, sir, in the back.
It seems to me like there should be some type of separation that's saying what the households are on the Marine Corps base, what the ones are in the town, what the income is out there, wages out there, what's in town, because I can't go out and use anything on the base, I can't go rent it out there or buy something out there, so the numbers matter. We're paying you to do that, so I would like to have a breakdown.
Understood, sir.
Thank you.
Again, the military base, right? The population of 29 pounds is skewed to the Marine base. So if we're excluding it, I don't know what effect on your study on this exclusion. Because it's the majority of our clients. I have rentals and 100% of them are Marine employees, active Marine employees. So if you're excluding it, your data might be inaccurate on that day. That may be wrong.
But again, Tony, we're not excluding it, right? I mean, this is all census data that we're extracting. We get the topics here, and we may need to drill down to some more census data if there is, or even extract it more from the base. But we're not excluding anything. I think we're taking everything straight from the census data in 19. The question is parsing it out. And you know, I don't know if we'll figure out how to way to parse it out.
If it says that workers, that doesn't include the Marine base or working group.
This is census data. So all the information that they gathered from DOF in 2019, this is it. This is the data. And then in 2020, obviously, will be the more accurate census that we all kind of went through. But this is probably Department of Finance's data.
No, it's
Section.
American Community Survey, which is what the state requires.
So Nicole, I think you've heard that the audience, that it would be really helpful to have a division between the two.
Yes.
And that would help us, come to a final conclusion on this plan.
And we will make sure that if there is any military data included in the census data, that it's identified separately. Thank you. Whoops. The median housing value that was reported was $158,800 for 2019, and a median rent at $957. Of the 8,900 households that we have, 68% rent, 32% own. There are 2,180 lower income renters households that are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. That's considered overpaying at under the HUD and HCP standards. And 490 lower income homeowners are paying more than 30% of their income for their housing. So I spoke briefly at the beginning about the regional housing needs allocation. It is a subdivision of the total number of units that the state of California estimates that we will require in the next 8 years. The state comes up with a big number and distributes it to the Southern California Association of Governments. And the Southern California Association of Governments distributes it amongst every city and county under its jurisdiction. The SCAG number for our planning period this cycle was 1.5 million. 1.5 million units that were distributed all over Southern California, from Ventura County through San Bernardino and Riverside counties, from edge to edge. And SCAG's allocation to us is a total of 1,047 units. Of those, 504 are above moderate income household units. Above moderate income is defined as 120% or more of the county median. And those are expected to be built and filled by market housing. So housing that is not subsidized or provided with restrictions for affordable housing households. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know why the state government has any business dictating what a city should have to do as far as housing. Where's their right? Is it in the California Constitution that they have that right?
It's Government Code Section 65,000 that prescribes the requirements for housing elements, including the assigning of the land.
Thank you.
We've been allocated a need of 185 moderate income housing units, 127 low income housing units, and 116 very low income housing units, and 115 extremely low income housing units. In terms of percentages, a moderate income household makes 80 to 120% of the county median. That was currently that's about $60,000. A low-income household makes 50 to 80% of the county median, and a very low-income household makes 30% or less than the county median. Yes, sir.
Nicole, that's based on San Bernardino County, not 29 homes.
That's
for
correct.
this allotment here. And I'm new to this process. This is just what they are recommending. These are the numbers that based on your numbers that you crunch, that says we need about 1,000 new houses in the next 8 years in 29 Palms to meet the needs of the population that we have.
Of the population expansion that they expect.
Okay, I understand that.
And what is difficult with these numbers is that the state and then SCAG calculate at 30,000 feet, right? They're based on the growth in the state, they're expecting this huge number of people. They then allocate it at the SCAG level to all of the cities and counties at the 25,000 square foot level, because it's still a regional estimate. 29 Palms, for its population, compared to the cities in the Coachella Valley that we're working with, has a relatively low allocation. So SCAG did take into account the relatively slow growth rate in 29 Palms over time, and some of the constraints that you have relating to sewer in particular, that's a long-term issue, and water provision. But the allocation has to be spread over all of the SCAG designations. And again, we don't need to build it. We have to facilitate it, make sure that there are not obstacles to it being built. I'll be right with you, I promise. And assist where possible, particularly with affordable housing, because that cannot be built without subsidy.
I was just going to talk about something. I'm with a nonprofit, Luckie Park Activities Center, and I went to the ICH meeting to be able to listen to the ICH meeting, which is Interagency Council on Homelessness, and they were reporting all this money coming out from Sacramento, just waves and waves of money to address funding that extremely low and very low.
Yeah, so
So I'm speaking from the point that I'm with a nonprofit called Malongo Basin Arts, and I was there yesterday and listened to Yucca Valley, and one of our biggest, everybody had agreed in Yucca Valley, I don't know how they feel here, but the people that I work with, the biggest issue we have is housing the homeless. In particular, that group that's called extreme low income, which are the people often that are on the streets are people that are getting SSI or have a very low retirement. And so also this population is growing to become seniors. So often we think, well, maybe they're the addicts or they're the mentally ill. But we're also running into the issue where there are seniors who are they've lost their housing. Their rental is being sold because they know they can get more if it gets upgraded and kicked out, and then they can't find a place to move to because they can't afford where they're going to go. So I know there's money coming down to start to address that, which is very encouraging. I've talked to Frank about Project Home Key, which is also going to be addressing that very low income, extremely low or very low income range. So there is funds coming. I know we're not talking about actually building, but the state of California is very much aware that they're going to have to bring in funds in order to get this out. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that our 29 Palms allocation is very low compared to the county. Is it possible to go back to my original assumption that since the military employment is not included in the data, that's why our allocation is smaller?
Now, I think it really has to do with sewer capabilities. That's the biggest driver. We'll get into that in a minute. That's the biggest driver.
And it's also historic growth. The 29 Palms has not grown at the same fast pace as many other communities. And so on a calculating these statistics. Cities that have long-term growth rates that are higher, have higher allocations. Cities that have slower growth rates and other constraints have lower allocations. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering whether there's going to be any examinations.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can I ask you to step to the
Well, the
mic?
parking.
Yeah, I know.
That's it, so it's also probably, you know, I'm just gonna say, I'm just wondering whether there's going to be any re-examination of some of the numbers, because we've just been through a pandemic, which probably had quite a severe impact on these growth numbers that you're quoting, you know, like the historically low growth of 29 Palms is probably shifting, and the fact that many people are going to shift from commuting to working at home, probably going to impact a lot of this. And yet we're going to be making, you know, decisions based on pre-pandemic data.
And unfortunately, we have no choice. The law says when we have to be finished, and this has been an argument that I have had with legislators and with HCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, which has to approve this housing element. That for example, they're doing an update 6 months before the census data comes out. So all of our data, which has to be based on certain sources, we don't have a choice. All of our data is 10 years old plus annual estimates. And the pandemic trend, no one knows. It's going to be years before, in terms of statistics, it's going to be years before we know how that affects all communities. Whether it's going to cause 29 Palms to grow faster because people don't want to live in big cities anymore. We're seeing some of those trends. Whether the state is very high on what it calls urban development. High densities, less cars on the road, and trust me when I say they don't step out of Sacramento ever. So they have no idea what 29 Palms looks like, what Yucca Valley looks like, what Palm Desert looks like. They make this assumption that all of these cities are growing like Sacramento with very intense development and should be happy about that. Trying to argue with them on that issue every 8 years causes my doctor anxiety and me even more. We will continue to try to explain to HCD that there are realities here that are different from Los Angeles or San Francisco or Sacramento. But it is very difficult to buck the state trend, especially with all the legislation that's passed regarding housing in the last 3 or 4 years. Ma'am, you've had your arm up and down a couple of times. Do you have something?
I think we addressed it with
Okay.
plans about the changing circumstances with COVID and people wanting to get out of a large city and coming out here to the desert. It's made a whole complete change.
And it will be some time before we can quantify that properly, unfortunately. So part of our requirement under the state, and I know this map is hard to read, but the state, the law requires that we identify sites for affordable housing units, particularly very low and low income units. In 29 Palms, the housing values and the rents are affordable to moderate, market rate, are affordable to moderate income households generally. And so the focus of the city is going to have to be on lower income households. So for very low and moderate income households, we have to facilitate the development and have sufficient sites for 543 units. We have identified sites on our first pass at our inventory for up to 1,568 units. Those are sites that have high-density residential designations already. There is one approved project in that list, which is the one that's on Conroe Way, which is still working itself through the process. That the state also mandates that sites be located throughout the city. We have, and most of the sites that we have in the inventory have been defined in the housing element in previous cycles. They're focused around Adobe Way so that there's synergy with workplaces and shopping places near the downtown so that affordable households can reach work and shopping without needing a vehicle if possible. They are all located next to water lines, which is a relatively new state requirement. They are also supposed to be located adjacent to sewer lines, and that is not possible in this city. And although the city is working hard to establish a sewer system, the challenge here that will be difficult to explain to HCD is going to be that we do not have sanitary sewer. And from the state's perspective, that is considered a constraint that is not facilitating the development of housing, because a housing developer, if they're going to build at higher densities, is going to have to also build a pocket plant. And the city's dealt with this in past housing elements, and we will deal with it again with HCD. And we're hopeful that all of the efforts that the city is making towards developing that sewer system will be something that they accept and understand. Yes?
Could I ask Travis to sort of give us a quick
Location?
You can't tell where that is. Can you give us some coordinates or something?
Well, yeah.
Here, Travis.
I'll try. So a lot of it is the areas that are already zoned high density residential. And that's why I brought that map there. It's a little bit more detailed, but the areas that have that designation are dark brown color in that map. And it gives you kind of a better idea of the exact location. And then I think we probably added a couple, right?
Yes, well, the Conroe.
Yeah, the Conroe Road, which was approved, and they did actually have a percentage of affordable housing as part of their approval, as part of their entitlement. And they got the density bonus also. Then a lot of it is here, kind of near City Hall in this area, this designated high density, and then some other areas as well along with Adobe that have high density. So the land is there. The zoning is there, but the infrastructure is not there to support that kind of density on septic systems.
Travis, can you define residential?
Yeah, it's 20 units per acre. And it's all relative. So what's high density residential to 29 homes is very different than in LA, right?
Did you say 20 houses per acre?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Have you looked at the property over by the post office? The zoning on that general vicinity?
Yeah, that is the area that we're looking at.
Ma'am, in the back?
I'm assuming when you say 20 units per acre, but you're also including apartment building.
Yes.
It is a park.
So when we
It
say
is a
apartment,
park.
so apartments are in this, it's just the verbiage, the traditional verbiage doesn't sound like we're drawing individual stuff. They
they are apartment units. Yes, ma'am. And that's the end of the statistics. I'm sorry? Well, we're gonna open it up for comments.
Okay, right, this is on the density.
Okay.
When the city was formed in 1987, we had.
Can you hang on?
I can't hear you.
Excuse me, can we have one conversation at a time, please, out of respect for everybody who's here? Go
Okay,
ahead.
when the city was formed in 1987, we had an ad hoc committee at the city hall, and pretty much our group advised, along with the city council and everything, was to retain our low density and small town atmosphere. We want to keep the dense population in specified areas, which it seems like is what's going on. We don't want to become another Palm Desert. We like our small town atmosphere. Okay, that was it. I just wanted to say that I worked on this density thing when the city became a city.
Okay.
Can you elaborate on the condor? You brushed it and I just don't know what's going on there.
So that's a 200 unit development off of Congo Road, cannot be accessed by Congo Road, right adjacent to the Marine Corps base. And they went through their entitlement stage, oh my gosh.
6 years ago.
Yeah, a while ago. And they've gotten an extension, but it's getting close to expiring. But they did go through all of the entitlement stage, got their approvals. There was some access issues that I believe they worked out. So just kind of waiting for confirmation on that, and then have to work with them.
But that project there is just, evident of the challenges. So it's fully entitled, ready to go, and it can't pencil. And, the sewer being the issue, the infrastructure being the issue. And we'll have the best plans in the world to kind of lay out, and we'll prove the data and all that. But at the end of the day, you gotta have the rents to pay it. We can't make the rents, right? Rents to pay it and the construction cost, the rents to support the construction costs. And that's where that project's at.
Thank you. So Pat?
I'm also thinking that in this discussion as it goes through that the Airbnbs and the short-term rentals are making a big impact on the city, on the whole basin. And that has something to do with what's available for the income ranges there.
So I do have the latest stats on EHRs in the city. Just put them this morning. We have 136 issued permits and 24 pending this morning. And that is out of a total of 9,000 housing units, but it is decreasing. Well, hang on, she was next. Yes, Mary.
So is there any, compensation the city can make to a builder that would come into town that would want to build, units to meet the requirements?
We are currently working with developers now, low and moderate income housing on potential sites. Again, fall back to the sewer issue. That tends to be a challenge with each developer that we work with. As Frank says, it's got to pencil out. Not having a functioning operating sewer system, one that you have to build as part of the housing, that gets capitalized as part of the housing, is a new challenge. It's a really big challenge.
Because of cost?
She was next.
I was just going to say, one of the questions I asked you before, which is, when you quote just now 9,000 housing, she must be talking about apartments and houses.
Yeah.
Those are 1,500 residential.
That's correct.
So those are the only houses that are available the only houses that are available for short-term vacation rentals are single-family residential dwellings.
That's
as far
correct.
as I know. And we've never yet determined how many of those 1,500 single-family residential dwellings are non-military.
Right.
I'm just pointing out what the stat is a little.
Astrid was next, and then
homes to be available to people who are going to live and work full-time in the city, not to investors that are going to come here and turn them over into vacation. It's very important.
All right, Tony?
Yeah, just, I want to follow up on her
But
also.
you're gonna need permits.
No,
these
Tony was next.
Huh?
Tony?
Oh,
Yeah, I want to follow up on her after, but my question, you keep on mentioning the challenge on the sewer. Does it mean it's cost, or is it environmental? What's the challenges against that you're talking about?
Well, part of it, and actually, let me get through some of my notes, so I think we'll be able to answer some of these questions. A part of it is, yeah, the cost of the house and the density that you're able to achieve out of a certain area is obviously more for sewer than if you're on septic. Okay, so that, and you know, the cost of all that gets spread into each house, right? If it's a packaged treatment plant, then that's a whole lot more cost per house that the developer would have to front. And you know, I've had this conversation with developers in the city. Steve can probably chime in. It scares off the big developers, the Lennars, the Pulte's, the Richmond Americans, the Toll Brothers. They don't want to have to deal with building new tract homes, subdivisions, totally on septic systems. That's not what they do. Everywhere they build, there's a public sewer system. So it really does scare off a lot of people because they're just not going to afford that. What the city can permit, this is just a little bit of data that might talk, set the stage. What the city can permit as far as septic systems is up to 3,500 gallons per day. Okay, that's our limit under the current state law. Over that, it goes to the Colorado River Water Control. Okay, so for example, the package treatment plant that we're putting downtown, Phoenix, gets its approval from the Colorado River Water Control Board because it's more than 3,500 gallons per day. So that's just one point. And with the state, it's a double-edged sword. While there's some benefits and there's some funding for housing, there's also some regulations that really work against it. And one of them is this new state policy on-site wastewater treatment facilities, which is a very fancy word for saying septic systems, right? The requirement is that if you're sitting on septic, any new subdivisions, in other words, you're taking raw land and you're creating a new subdivision, the minimum lot size is now 2.5 acres. Okay, that's pretty rural. Okay, and also a detriment again to building affordable housing. Not too many people are going to put, a affordable house, certainly for the very low income, under 2.5 acre lot. So that's a real challenge. Let me get through this, and I promise I'll give you an another headwind, I'll call these headwinds, but I have some tailwinds. There's good news, all right? Another headwind that we have is during the real estate boom, that we all went through, that essentially crashed 2008, 2009 timeframe. The city had actually entitled a lot of subdivisions, at least 10 to 14, depending on when they were entitled. And a lot of those are expiring. Okay, they went through what we call a tentative tract map. That's kind of like the first stage, and then the second stage is you go to a final map when you're ready. So the city had entitled, again, 10 to 14, depending on when they came into the system. But they're all expiring now. Okay, the city was very generous in giving all the extensions. We haven't refused any extensions. And then the state also gave another 6 years of extensions because of the recession. But now those are all expired. We had probably a handful, I think 3 or 4 left that still have a year or two. And then you pretty much have to start over, right? And starting over now means CEQA. It means tribal consultation. It means a lot of things that do drive up the cost of housing that did not exist back in 2008. So that is also a detriment to building new tract housing in the city. I'll say, some of the more recent things are cost of building materials. We've all seen that. I think that's temporary. I think we'll get back to a good place on that. I think a lot of it is pandemic driven, and hopefully it comes back down. Cost of labor is another one. I'm not sure if that's temporary. If we don't have the workers coming into the system replacing the ones that are retiring, especially with the baby boom, I'm not sure that that one's going to get any less tighter than it is now. So those are some of the headwinds I saw. So now for the good news, tailwinds, and I'll start with how I see it anyway, and that is the fees for building in the city of 29 Palm are pretty low compared. When you compare to all the others. We do have a fees in lieu of for road improvements, and I know that can be high, especially if you have a rural lot with a lot of frontage. So if you have a 5-acre lot, or even a 2.5-acre lot that's on the corner, those fees in lieu can be kind of expensive because it's based on your frontage. The city is looking to change that to a standard impact fee. So it's more equitable. Large lots aren't necessarily penalized in the process. And then the other fee that we have is the school fee. Now I compare this to where I came from, the city of Redlands. There was a road fee, there was a stormwater management fee, there was a park impact fee, there was a library impact fee. There were a lot more fees than we have here in the city of 29 Palm. So in perspective, relatively low cost. We do have plenty of land here. There's a lot of land. And one thing I'll also point out, even though we have this thing going on with the new subdivisions and the tracts, if you look at our parcel map and overlay it with an aerial, you can see that we have hundreds and hundreds of vacant lots. So if you drive around pretty much any tract, and almost any new subdivision, you will see a lot of vacant lots. So whether it's Hanson Tract or Indian Cove or Desert Vista, some of them, third to half of the platted lots are vacant. So why do I say that's good news? Well, you just do your perk test and you submit your building plans and you're ready to go. There's no planning process that you have to go through. There's no planning commission approval, those sorts of things. So that makes it a whole lot easier. Now they're scattered all over the city, not necessarily all on one street. But that's a pretty good thing to do. We've recently seen in my office where some people are getting wise to that and coming in with what we call stock plan. Here's a house approved. It goes through the building safety review, and then they take that house and they build it on multiple lots. So that's a cost savings to them. So they only pay for the review of the building plans once, and they do a little extra work for the site, make sure it drains properly and things like that. So we are seeing an uptake. When Nicole was right, there was a time in 29 Palms, actually, when I first started, where we were building almost 0 to say 5 single-family homes a year. That is just no growth at all. Last year we permitted 14 single family, wrapped up about as many on the multifamily side, so now I'm saying we're probably headed towards 25 to 30 units per year. Has it picked up? Yes. There's been a lot more interest that I've seen coming in at the counter. There has not been a mass stampede of people from LA that you hear about it. Hasn't happened. So far this year, I think we've issued 8 permits for single family homes. So if we keep up that rate, we'll probably be at 25 to 30 at the end of the year. So that's one thing I want to say. The other thing, and this is where the state give it and the state take it away, right? So the state recently passed another state law on what we call ADUs, accessory dwelling. So in essence, it's force the cities, force the communities to permit ADUs, on single family lots in almost every district, providing you've got certain conditions on that. So in our case, providing there is enough septic service that could service both the main house and an accessory well. Okay. That's going to be tough to do on the 7,200 square foot lot, but on a 10,000 square foot lot, it's not that tough. So that is one way the state is trying to assist in increasing the number of units without necessarily going through a whole new subdivision process. So ADUs are now, we had ADUs before in our ordinance, we called them granny flats before, it was kind of a local term. But now they've gotten easier to do. A few more points and I swear I'll stop. I'm on a roll now. Other things that I find interesting is new technologies in housing construction. And this is something that's, I think, is not here yet, but it's on the horizon. And we all know the modular home. The modular home is being reinvented now, and it's becoming much more affordable. I've been tracking the technology on 3D printed homes, where they come in and they literally set a crane in the middle and they essentially print a home out of concrete or concrete mixture, and it can be done a whole lot faster than traditional stick building. So I think there's some hope there in what technology can offer. And then the last point that I'll make is I do see demand increasing in the city. It's still not a stampede at this point. There have been a couple of interest parties in some of the existing track maps, tentative track maps, which have not gone through final map. They have to hurry because the clock is ticking and they expire, and then you have to sort of start all over. So those are kind of just some of the good things and bad things and points that I would make.
I'm curious as to how larger parcels, for instance, for example, the 218 plus acre area that has recently been advertised in Union Code for sale for residential building on the corner of Sony Road and Union Avenue. How does that play into all of this? For example, if a builder bought that stuff, a company bought that and wanted to build high density homes in that area, would that be included in the 1,000 homes that you plan on building throughout the city for the year? And what would be put in place to ensure that that land would not be ripped to shreds, tractored over, and only the footprint for the house would be able to be cleared to put the house on and native, critical native habitat would be kept intact as it borders the parks? There's a lot of questions in that.
What governor's looking to be built on that lot, and I brought them out so you could point it out to me, and I can show you what the zoning is on it. But remember what I said, the new state requirement is now a minimum lot size of 2.5 acres for any new subdivisions.
Okay, so that parcel of land would be limited to 2.5 acres per home.
No, it's 5 acres, it's a 5 acre, that parcel's 5 acres.
It depends
No,
on.
It depends on the zoning. So
It's 5 acres on this map.
Yeah.
No, it's 218 acres, that's.
Yeah, but
No,
it's
but-
5 acres per
Oh,
So the smallest lot in that area is 5 acres.
Okay, so they would be limited to, they would have to have a 5 acre lot in order to build a house
Per
within
unit.
that 200 acres.
And that varies throughout the city. There are varying densities that the majority of the affordable units will occur on land that is zoned for higher density.
I get it. And what about the 107 acres of the city of 29 Palms owns west of Upper Mountain Road off of Sullivan Road South that is also on the park border? There's 57 of those acres are gated and metered, and the remaining acres are not. So is that also under the same 5 acre limitation per home?
Well, I think it's got the same challenges of density and sewer, so if there's no sewer there to
Well, there isn't.
support that,
Correct.
then it's going to be a challenge to build affordable housing in the area.
So those will not be affordable homes that are built there. There will be homes on 5 acres each that will probably have a much higher price tag.
Yes.
I'm just trying to get a picture in my head. what they could be bringing to my neighborhood.
We have a general plan land use map and a zoning map. That breaks out all kinds of land uses. So you set aside the commercial land uses for retail and that sort of thing. There is a whole range of density for residential. And that is dependent on neighborhood. And the closer you are to downtown, the higher the density. Pretty much the minute you leave that downtown core, the density goes way down. And particularly on the periphery of the city, it is acres per house, not houses per acre.
And one thing I want to add is, so even if the state has this new requirement, we haven't gone back and changed our land use map, because then we would essentially be downzoning a lot of the properties.
We can't do that.
We don't want to do that. And
AB 330 doesn't like it.
yeah, so it's kind of it's crazy that, okay, it's owned for 1 acre, but then you're saying I can't build 1 acre lots because then you're going to lot size is 2.5 acres. But we're leaving it there, and there's always the potential for some of these areas to be sewer and that density to be achieved. The other thing I want to mention is those rules do not apply to existing lots of record. So it's already platted, it's been there for a while. They have the right to build. And one other challenge, throw this out there, that we do have in the city is access, legal access. I don't know what some of the forefathers were thinking when they platted, when they took up the land and divided it, but they were not thinking that all those parcels would be accessed by a road or easement or a path. And so there have been many times when people, and I'll throw out one area, who knows about section 19? I heard that it was a newspaper giveaway. Is that true? All kinds of mistakes.
In the 1950s or 60s is what I heard.
Yeah, when you bought a subscription, you got a piece of land, so I don't know if that's true at that time. So it all platted, tons of lots. Nobody has legal access to it. Nobody can plat a road or easement. People pick them up really cheap at tax sale, and they think, oh great, this is a really cheap lot, I can go out and build on it. And they can, without trespassing over 400 or 500 neighbors to get to their property. We have that situation throughout town. Now people do research, often they'll find, hey, there is an old patent or an old easement that existed from the 30s or 40s or even before that will provide access to their property. But that is also another challenge. Thank you.
So you mentioned earlier there's 160 either Airbnbs or pending Airbnbs.
136 issues.
Plus 20. So there's this perception amongst the residents here is that, Airbnbs are taking over and it's really impacting the housing market. And from what I hear you saying, if it's only 160 out of a total of 9,000 units in the town, it's a relatively small thing. How accurate do you think this is? Do you have any idea about how many illegal Airbnbs are out there? Have you thought about that?
I would say not too many, because we have software that enforces that. So the city purchased software about a year ago called Host Compliance. And, so it will take the addresses of people who advertise on not just Airbnb, but VRBO and all the others, and it will compare it to our database of people who are properly registered. And if they're not permitted, it will flag it and send it to us. I think Tony.
I've done that.
Tony got one time. It does to be hotels. So we know it's working, right?
Okay,
So
well, I'm gonna have to backtrack now.
So we catch a lot of those people. Now that's the city. Outside the city, Wonder Valley, Desert Heights, I can't speak to that.
Mary Jane has had her hand up for
Yes.
an hour and a half.
So, three things. Number one, we've already got the concrete houses. They're right over here on Halsey, right
state of California, and that includes 29 homes, to build an affordable housing unit for a very low income household without help from outside agencies, even at very high densities, because the cost of building is the cost of building, and generally rents are restricted to no more than 30% of the household's income on a monthly and annual basis. The challenge that is starting, and Astrid, you brought that up a little bit for homeless residential projects. The challenge has been that the affordable housing community needs to get funding from, what we're hearing now is anywhere from 12 to 20 sources, different funding sources, to be able to get sufficient funds to build it, so that to put it in simple terms, so that the mortgage is low enough that they can charge the low rents and still stay above water. In the last 3 years, there has been a tremendous amount of legislation out of Sacramento that included bonding measures that are just now being implemented. And so the state is actually has funds to allow the development that they've legislated that we need to have, the very low and low income housing units, to get those funded, where there was in the past for the traditional funding sources, there were dozens and dozens more proposed projects than there were monies to cover.
What about USDA?
USDA is one of those 12 to 20 sources that affordable housing developers you can't get an affordable housing project funded through one agency anymore. It's not physically possible. Because of the point systems that they use, because of the allocations that they have. And so a subsidized project to be able to keep the rents low will go for tax credits from the state, USDA funding, private funding, investor funding. And that adds cost as well, because most of those are competitive processes, and most of the projects don't make it through the first time. So you're having to carry the land that you're trying to develop for longer than you have to.
How did Yucca do it?
I'm sorry?
How did Yucca Valley build theirs?
That was mostly redevelopment money, which is okay. Until 2012, they killed it. Before the early 2010s, in the state of California, there was redevelopment law that allowed local jurisdictions to determine, to establish an area that it wanted to redevelop. There were property tax benefits to the city from doing that. When you established a redevelopment area, the value of the land was set at the date that you established it, and any value beyond that, the majority of the property tax came to the city instead of going to the county, as traditionally property tax does. And a portion of that was called tax increment, the increment above the base value that you started with. A portion of that, 20% of that, had to be set aside for affordable housing. And so redevelopment agencies, which are cities or towns, in the case of Yucca Valley, would receive funds they had to use for affordable housing, but that were funds that were over what they would normally get, because it was from that redevelopment. You didn't have to develop affordable housing within that redevelopment area, but within your corporate limits. And particularly in smaller communities that had a steady growth rate, they established very large redevelopment areas. And so they were getting extra property tax from most of their community. And as a result, they were getting these funds. There was a lot of abuse of redevelopment funds, but it was the best way the state had for local communities to be able to help with the funding of affordable housing projects. In 2010, during the crash, when the state budget went upside down, the state took away redevelopment and went further than that. In case you haven't noticed, this is a pet peeve of mine, so I could talk about this for a long time. But they made cities give back land and call bonds that they had out for various projects. It was very detrimental to cities. Yucca Valley had a long-standing redevelopment area. They had not expended a lot of funds, and so and that was typical, especially in small towns. You would keep your housing set-aside funds from your tax increment and build it up until it was big enough that it was of value, right? Because you weren't making a lot every year, but after 5 years, you had a decent amount, and it was enough that you could either buy a property and then make that an incentive, sell it to an affordable housing developer at a discount or for nothing, and help fund projects. So Yucca Valley was keeping their money together and spent it on one larger project. For them,
We went through that too, and we ended up getting redevelopment money into the project payments. So thank you for the explanation. I wasn't sure how.
It was long-winded, I apologize for that. You should do that.
My last question is, Travis, so when the builders come,
Yes.
and because sewers is just, a problem, but we have some developments where they have their own system within the development. What about, can they charge a HOA fee?
Sure. And we actually have that situation, Turtle Rock,
Right.
those are no. I think those are the only two. So in each of those instances, a developer essentially built a package street.
Yes, can they offset that? I mean, you're saying, what I heard you say, was that sewage was an issue.
Right.
So to compensate for that issue, charge an HOA.
And that's what and that's what happened. So that is paying into the maintenance of that package treatment plant. Unfortunately, in each one of those, they were not built out, they were not developed to the fullest. And one of the things about package treatment plants is you need a certain amount of flow to make them work properly. So if it's only half built out, it causes problems in just the operation and maintenance of it. But yeah, we've had 2 subdivisions that have gone that route. It's not ideal, and Frank, if he was still here, he could take off. He says all the time, it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable to have a city dotted with all of these package treatment plants all around, each requiring their own separate maintenance. What makes sense is a community sewer system. That is sustainable. All the effluent is going to one location. It's better treated. It's actually tertiary treatment, not just primary or 10, 15 years, but a lot of it comes down to funding. We do have some seed funding, and this is what I was saying before, the state taking the state also gives, everything taken away. So the state has, in essence, given us a large amount of seed money, grant money, to begin this process of the planning of public sewer system. Now, obviously, it would be targeted to the denser areas of the city. It does not make sense necessarily to run it out to the eco area.
But what if it becomes more developed? Is there a law that dictates that you have to have a sewer system as opposed to tanks?
No, there's no law that dictates that.
Population, there isn't.
Or else we would violate that law. Yeah. But obviously it makes sense to plan it at the core, to service commercial. And then people say, oh, the septics are fine, nothing's wrong with our septic. I can tell you, for my job, we have a lot of issues with septic, especially in commercial, especially with fast food restaurants, sometimes with hotels. They're just not made for that type of volume. So there are some real challenges. Let me sort of follow up on that. So we started that process. We have a consultant looking at it, our engineer. She's done her first cut, and I think it's a pretty good one. She's like, well, how can we design this so that it's mostly gravity fed? And we're not using a lot of pump stations and force mains, which can be expensive to maintain and take it to the treatment plant. So we got a very early first cut at it. Actually, Nicole's going to be involved in doing environmental for that project. But it's a long haul. And then, as you probably know, ideally we're working with the base who have the plant, who have the funding for the plant, and we work on an agreement, we can share the plant. But then we are still responsible for all the piping, all the trunk lines and service lines that come throughout the city. And that's a lot. I think I've heard that Yucca Valley's was 140 million. I don't know if that's completely accurate. It's a big price tag.
I just had one comment.
Okay, and then Jamie, you're next.
The question was, do you have, are the tracks and the town tracks, is there a map that shows those, or are they on that map?
They're not on that map.
I'm just kind of curious, is there a map somewhere that the city has that can be, like, considered?
I think I got a description. We wanted to plot them every time we started to, we're like, oh, that one's expired. Oh, that one's expired.
It just would be interesting at this point to know where they're located.
Most of them are in the denser part of the city. Most of them are in RL 4, 3, 2.
And then my other comment was, when you're quoting the vacation home rental statistics, I just wanted to get it again, it's not 9,000 units, because that includes apartments, which cannot be vacation or permanent for vacation home rentals. So it's more like 200 units, but also the issue with those rental, and we've all discussed it from time to time, isn't that there's 160 permits for 5,000 units, it's that the permits tend to cluster, and so people get surrounded by them. And so it's like, when you look at those numbers, it's slightly distorts what's actually happening on the ground. That's the point.
Understood. Jamie?
So, 29 Palms had redeveloped money. What is the status on the low-income housing that 29 Palms was proposing?
We're still working with housing developers. The first
It's a matter of getting the right deal. We're planning on doing it. It's a matter of the right deal.
the right developer, the right deal. The first one that we had,
And how many units are we up to now?
I think we're still in the 60 unit range. That's still the target. But the first one could not make it pencil out. It's tough. It's really tough, even with the subsidies, even with the land. It just doesn't pencil out. We talked to the second one, and the second one said, you guys don't have a sewer system. This is going to be a real challenge. Now we're talking to a third one, and so they're a little bit more optimistic, I think. So it's tough. It may not end up being the one big project, it may be several small may not end up being the one big, larger project, it may be several smaller projects. But obviously, from the density point of view, it makes sense to do one larger project that could have its own separate service.
So what's frustrating to me is the local 29 Palms guys, I kind of believe in supply and demand, filling the demand when it's really there, and letting the small guy go and do something. So if there's a profit to be made, then somebody's going to do it. Don's going to build some houses, Steve's going to build some houses, some other small guys are going to build some houses. But I've been at general plan meetings where everybody says, we don't want high density. And then I appreciate you stating that, there are 25,000 feet, and you got somebody in San Francisco or Sacramento, telling us what we need to do in our little small community. And that's where my frustration comes from. And then, when you go and you build this little house, you ruin it for a lot of other people that have invested in it because they don't have the funds, the big guys to come and do stuff. They're doing ones and twos here. And you lose that small town atmosphere that, was appealing to 29 Palms. If you want to build a little Orange County subdivision right there, then, you're losing part of the field in mind. So appreciate some of the comments you made this evening about Sacramento.
It's frustrating, and each year, I wish that Assembly would just take a year off, right? Because each year we get this list. Here are all the bills that are proposed, and it is pages and pages and pages. And I think one of the latest one is, it's gotten traction, is essentially doing away with single-family zoning and pretty much saying you can build duplexes in any area that's zoned for single family. That has actually happened in the state of Oregon. Now, they have a housing crisis too, and they basically had gone away with single family zoning. There's some caveats to society. Town has to be 10,000 people or something like that. But basically, it's allowed, correct me if I'm wrong, it's allowed someone to come in and say, you've got a subdivision of just single family homes and try to come in and put duplexes. In some areas, you can put triplexes.
That one has not passed yet.
So, there's a movement out there on not just California, it's in other states. More housing, more housing, more housing. How do we do it? For a lot of legislation.
Over here.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure, at least it looks like you point at me and somebody else talks. Okay, my thing is, we've got now potentially 139 VHRs, which could have been single residential dwellings. My suggestion as for my question, why isn't it the city can't zone 20 or 40 acres specifically for VHRs? And then these investors can come and build something instead of snatching up the local housing and putting people out on the street and making it unaffordable.
Interesting concept.
And they can also do like the 29 Palms Inn on that type of thing. Make bungalows for families to come and stay for a weekend. But the problem is, up in Indian Cove, they say rental limit 6. The one behind me, there's been 20 people there. And I've been told that the planning commission said there has not been complaints on VHRs, and that's not true because I have personally made complaints.
So far, we've had 3 official complaints.
On Altaloma specifically. And the first time I complained, the man had been operating for months without permits. And after that one party, there were over 20 young men there, he told, that was when Jim Kohlenberg was code enforcement, he told Jim, oh, well, my daughter must have taken the keys and had a party. I said, if she was there having a party, what kind of a party where she's having with 20 young men?
Okay.
Come on.
Okay.
Can I address Lynn? Lynn? Hello, Lynn? Can I address you? A lot of these PHRs, our people are buying old dilapidated houses that nobody would live in. And they're fixing them up, cleaning up, a lot of these, they're cleaning up our town.
Well, that's true, but they could sell them, or rent them out to single families. I mean, it's residential instead of Degree taking over and getting big money for weekend rentals.
Well, I don't know about greed and money, but
Well, I've seen a lot of the prices on these.
being a landlord and having people come in and destroy my houses, being in a VHR is much better because they respect your
It
property.
doesn't matter either way, you get renters that'll destroy property.
Excuse me, I understand that short-term rentals are an issue. In terms of the housing element, they are not immediately germane. And the percentage in terms of the number of vacation rentals that you have in town is not a constraint to the provision of housing from the housing element perspective. And I don't say that to be rude about, and I understand you have concerns, but the housing element is not, at the short-term vacation rentals are not a housing element issue. Yes, ma'am.
Well, part of the problem is I'm a retired master guns. And before when you rented a house in 29th Long and you had Marines that didn't pay their rent or tore it up, you could call the commanding officer or the master guns and say this is what they're doing, and it was taken care of. Today's military, you're not allowed to call the command. I have a good friend that's a retired CHP officer. She was in the Marine Corps. She owns a house up Baseline. It's got destroyed 2 times by the military, and there's nothing she can do about it. She just stole it to be a vacation rental. So I'm just giving you guys straight up. I know when I was here, if I had Marines that were doing something to their residents, they had no problem contacting the command. That is no longer allowed. So if you have a problem with the military personnel, you have to go through the regular channels that you would if it was any other person in your room. That's part of the problem right there.
I didn't know that.
So you're gonna have low house rent, places built, but then what stops there to be a bidding war? And then people who they were meant to be low income people can't get in there because people are out from out of state or out of town. There's a bidding war, so it started at 150, now it's 400. How do you make sure that it goes to low?
The state requires that affordable housing units be deed restricted. So, deed restricted. So if it's an ownership unit, and an ownership unit in 29 Palms would be a moderate income unit. If it is supposed to be permanently for moderate income, so if they got financing from outside sources that require that they be permanently for affordable housing, they have to deed restrict for a minimum of 55 years. Yes.
Just because I'm trying to, is the housing element only about ownership of housing, or does it also deal with availability of rental housing?
Both.
Oh, okay.
And again, for very low income households, it is highly unlikely that it will be ownership housing.
Yeah.
Low income households, there are a number of developers who build ownership units. They call it self-help. You may have seen Habitat for Humanity, for example. They build ownership units, usually for low-income households, because maintaining a mortgage, just the minute you get into a mortgage, even if it's a small mortgage, a very low-income household will not qualify. But a low-income household does. And those kinds of units are ownership also deed restricted. So that over the life of the deed restriction, and they're usually 55 years also, they can be as low as 30, but they're usually 55 years. They can, if they sell, and the idea with Habitat, I call them Habitat houses because they seem to be the one, Habitat for Humanity seems to be the one that gets the most press. The idea with that was the seed for Habitat for Humanity was if you can get someone out of a rental and into private ownership, then as their life improves and they can afford a slightly better house, then the next person coming in is the next person who is starting out and trying to build that better life. And those kinds of projects have been very successful, and they're always tiny, right? They have just a few lots that folks, they can only do a few families at a time, but those neighborhoods are, in most communities I've seen them built, are really thriving neighborhoods because there's a commitment there. I get on my soapbox a lot about subjects.
That kind of housing is really crucial to the development of the downtown plans. I mean, that are happening. You can't develop that downtown. I mean, I remember as a kid walking downtown at night. It was great. I mean, 60 years ago. But if you can get some housing happening out there, it's decent housing, even if it's low-income housing, it will bring people into that space and populate their shops and their products.
And actually, that's a little bit off topic, but we are working, well, Nicole is working hard on the housing element update. We have another whole planning process in the works, and that is an update to our downtown specific. And we will be holding another workshop in probably
June 16th.
Yeah, June 16th, I think is the tentative date for that, to present the initial early ideas of that plan. And we are looking at things like low to moderate income housing, but more workforce housing. People that say work at a restaurant or one of the hotels and are having a hard time finding a place to, so I call it workforce, but it generally falls into low, moderate. So that's the whole planning process is going on simultaneously while this is going on.
Astrid, and then you, sir.
I kind of wanted to go back to what we were talking about in Project Home Key. And the advantage of Project Home Key is that you're looking at an existing property that can be rehabbed. So you don't have to worry about the septic tank, everything is already there, it's already been used for something. And then, of course, this money is coming in from the state. I think it was 200,000 per unit to rehab it. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that we tried to do this last year and we didn't qualify for the grant. There was 3 other projects that were funded, but 29 Palms has this opportunity to reapply. The question I have is like, where can we find property in 29 Palms that we can rehab? And it will qualify for this grant. That's what I was going to talk Frank about. I have Cindy Moore, and then Cindy Moore to start looking. I don't know. We've been looking for quite a while, trying to find something that maybe would qualify for a project.
Well, there's one of them, but there's a whole slew of state programs, and they range everything from straight out grants to loans and a mixture of both. There was one that the city was looking at, respected affordable housing developers, which was very enticing to the city. And it's called, see if I get this acronym right, AH. Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities. Okay, and this particular, it's a grant loan combination. And it actually comes from the whole cap and trade. And part of it is meant to fund the affordable housing. That's the loan part. But with it comes a grant that's for pure infrastructure for a city. And it's very appealing to a city like ours, which, you know, we don't have a lot of great infrastructure with respect to sidewalks, bike paths, and things like that. It won't allow to build roads, but it will build sidewalks, bike paths, bus stops, transit areas. And that particular program was really, really enticing to us because it had that combination. We were able to help meet some of our affordable housing goals, but at the same time improve our infrastructure. We just weren't prepared last year to submit an application.
And it's highly competitive.
And very, a lot of these are very competitive. I'm not sure we'll be ready in February. They usually do next February, given everything else that's going on. But
Last year, home key, you had to like submit the application. I know I was getting surgery that day, and it was like October 13th. And then you had to have like maybe a portion of it complete by the end of the year. It was an incredibly fast program, and people had to move in rapidly. Whatever you did, you had to fix it right away.
It's a stupid question, but probably a stupid answer. Because it's alcohol. How much affordable housing is in Bel Air, Beverly Hills, Montecito? Pasadena? I'm serious. If it's state mandate,
I left my list at home, but they all have allocations.
but they have allocations, but do they actually have low-income housing, affordable housing for the low and moderate income families?
Yes,
I've never seen it.
Actually, the Montecito I can't speak to. Santa Barbara has a very active
Yes, I know
affordable
they-
housing program.
Beverly Hills.
Beverly Hills has affordable housing units. I know that for a fact. The communities make varying efforts to meet their RENA allocation. Some of them are much more committed to it than others. Some of them have better funding capability than others. Small cities have always struggled.
But you're not going to have a mansion and a low-cost house next door.
Well, there is some of that, but the state has gotten more and more control through laws, not because there's an agency out there doing its own thing, but legislation has become more and more restrictive so that there are now penalties for not making efforts to meet our RENA allocation. And those penalties are almost certainly going to get stronger during this next planning cycle because there is a strong segment of the legislature that is focused on increasing affordable housing mandates and decreasing local control. And the laws that we have seen passed in the last 3 cycles since 2017 was huge. There was a package of bills that was signed by Governor Brown that completely turned affordable housing and housing elements on their head and started to chip away at local regulation. And that is increasing every year. Yes, sir.
Would not Beverly Hills low income be much higher than 29 Palms though? So like, if
Yeah.
$10,000,
Oh, yeah.
right, where it's 20.
The one I always use is San Francisco. The median housing price, right, median, middle range in San Francisco this year is $1.4 million. That's middle. So if that's middle, then the only people who can live in San Francisco are above moderate income households, which is why they are very active with subsidized housing. Unfortunately, cities like San Francisco take away funding possibilities for smaller cities because they qualify better for those for the funding. So there's this never-ending circle that is very difficult to break. That the San Franciscos of the world will get better points for the funding that I was describing before. They will get better points from those funding sources, so they will take more of the funding, and it becomes more difficult for small cities like here to be able to compete for those programs. Yes, sir?
I'm wondering if you know offhand what the amount of RDA money we have planned for the housing. And then I'm just wondering also, there's a couple of semi-government people that deal with other people, what you think about the 39 housing units, little houses, tiny houses in Los Angeles that cost $5.4 million.
Don't quote me exactly, Jamie, but I think it was 2 million of that was housing fund from Project Phoenix, but I'll get you
Yeah,
that.
that doesn't sound like a lot.
Yeah, I'll get you that exact number.
Okay.
The tiny house movement, I guess, or solution, and I've seen actually essentially homeless housing using tiny houses. I'll just say it was kind of contrary to 29 development code. Now, we do have a minimum house size in the city of 400 square feet. Most everybody knows that. But we also have a minimum of a 2-car garage for single-family housing. So, to build a house in,
That's the size of the garage.
yeah, which is 400 square feet. So that's kind of where you start out at. You want to build the basic, 400 square foot house, you could, but it comes with a
2-car garage.
2-car garage. And that's actually in our general plan, the 2-car garage.
That's my silly. Travis, the way you would get around that is a mobile home park.
Mobile home. Yeah, so,
I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying, so, you know, I mean, so what I'm trying to do is figure out how we are going to make this work.
right.
And it's kind of come down to either shared housing, which is a whole other topic, or maybe a mobile home park idea, because some people that we are getting, we're assisting in wind up buying an RV, and that becomes a problem, then they can't find a place to park it. So we're looking at, I don't know if Project Monkey could rehab a little more. I don't know.
That's a good question.
Yes.
I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know if you know if I can.
But mobile homes are certainly, when I'm
That way, it's a way to avoid a lot of the park homes and keep your wheels.
mobile homes are certainly one avenue for affordable housing, and they're a different animal because they're actually regulated by the state. So you go through HCD, essentially managing, maintaining a mobile home park. Typically, there's an entitlement process that goes through the city, but then it stops, and then it's an HCD. Now, our
The
problem,
units are, especially.
our problem is we've had several mobile home parks that, let's be honest, they suffered from maintenance and upkeep. Who remembers Shady Elms on Adobe Road? Okay. I made that my #1 priority when I took this job, to clean that up. Because it was just, you could have filmed The Walking Dead out of that. Perfect setting for it. That's what I thought when I saw it. And we had to get, a little tough with the property owner, but eventually we got it all cleaned up. There's another one that we're working on. Some of the others are kind of in varying states, but there are opportunities there because there's a lot of babies that are still open that you can bring mobile home and, or what they call now the art homes. Yeah, which are kind of a little nicer mobile home. They look more like a single family home, but they're still small. They come in on wheels and you can.
Different, Blue Skies has that available, the Joshua Tree, Lazy Age or something, they have a little activity, put them on a lot. And they went to
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up here. We've been almost 2 hours. So I really appreciate you coming out. We will let you know when we have a draft available. We will put it on the city's website. Please remember, it's just a draft. It will go to the state. And the state will do all kinds of magic on it. And then it will come back to us for revisions. Do you want to? And then also just a reminder, we're also working on a companion downtown specific plan, so a lot of new ideas there. Thank you all.